Now, another useful measure is something called per capita real GDP. Now, what per capita means, it just means per person, right? And this is useful because, okay, we'll see some numbers in a second to see why this is useful. But basically, putting it in per person terms gives us a much better idea of how an economy is doing, and it allows us to compare one economy to another, say the United States economy to the Chinese economy, right? Because if we just looked at total GDP, it wouldn't really give us a sense of the value of production per person, right? Because we have to keep in mind, China has 3 to 4 times as many people as the United States does. And so even though, in a couple of years, maybe 5 or 10 years, they will probably have a bigger economy than us, we will actually still be doing better in per person terms because we have fewer people than they do, right? So this per capita GDP, real GDP, is a useful measure in comparing two different countries. And it's pretty simple to calculate. You just take real GDP and you divide it by the country's population to get a per person measure. Something else that's important is the foreign exchange rate. So this is just the price of one currency in terms of another. So, for example, a euro might cost $1.25, or vice versa, a dollar might cost 0.8 euro. So this is what a foreign exchange rate is. It's just purchasing one currency for another. So this can also be useful in helping us compare countries because France, for example, doesn't express its GDP in dollars. It expresses its GDP in euros. So if we want to compare France to the United States, we're going to need to use the foreign exchange rate to convert their French income per capita of 28,944 euros and convert that into dollars so that we can compare it to the U.S. economy and real GDP per capita in the U.S. So if we do that, we simply multiply the 28,900 by $1.25 to convert it into dollars. And the last thing you need to know about is something called purchasing power parity. This is basically just an adjustment in exchange rate conversions that takes into account differences in the cost of living between countries. So something else that's important when we want to compare two countries and their production. So it basically makes it so that it's an adjustment in the exchange rate so that there is equal purchasing power between the currencies, in other words. So it's something we need to do in order to again, it's taking into account the fact that there's different costs of living in different countries, right? So it's much cheaper to live in South American countries than it is in the United States, and so purchasing power parity takes this into account. All right, we're going to wrap up this section and this chapter with an international policy example first. So thinking again about purchasing power parity comparisons. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, maybe you've heard of it, accepted the purchasing power parity approach a few years ago, probably 5 years ago or so at this point. And it started presenting statistics on countries' GDPs relative to each other and based on purchasing power parity relative to the dollar. And so, as it turns out, China's per capita GDP is higher based on purchasing power parity. So it's not, if you don't account for the fact that it's much cheaper to live in China, but once you account for the fact that it's much cheaper to live in China, it turns out that it looks like China's population on a per capita GDP measure is actually doing better than us. So that's kind of interesting. Even though if you ignore the cost of living difference, the United States produces much, much more. It's so much more expensive to live here that they actually might be doing better off than us, even though they don't produce as much in terms of value. All right, so here's a table looking at some different GDP measures internationally. So the first column is GDP based on purchasing power parity. But this is total. So, of course, United States, biggest economy in the world. Oh, except look at China. If we take into account purchasing power parity and account for the fact that it's much cheaper to live in China, they're actually doing better than us on the whole, in total. The center column is per capita GDP, also based on purchasing power parity. And again, looking at that, the United States is actually the best off per person. So even though China in total has a bigger economy when taking into account costs of living differences, on a per person basis, the United States is actually doing much better. Looks like almost 4 times as better, right? So somebody in the United States is almost 4 times as well off as someone in China. And the last one there is per capita GDP based on foreign exchange rates alone, without looking at purchasing power parity, without looking at differences in spending, in cost of living. And so when we ignore that cost of living aspect, it looks like Chinese people are doing even worse than us, right? So hopefully this helps you understand these concepts a little bit better. But if you're interested, I would encourage you to pause the video and look at this for a minute.